Welcome to this episode of 9 Marks Pastor's Talk. 9 Marks exists to provide biblical resources to help build healthy churches. Learn more at 9marks.org. I'm here today with Jonathan Lehman.
Hello.
Hello, Jonathan. And we're here because Jonathan has written a new book called One Assembly. Now, Jonathan, this book is so explosive in its thesis that we're hoping to do 2 conversations about this. In the second one, we're going to explore the argument of the book, which is only 3 chapters, but it's thick stuff.
Yeah.
And there's intros and appendices, and I mean it's a well-packed book. But in the first discussion right now, and that's what you're listening to right now, the first conversation. In the first conversation, I want us to think more about our reason we would have this conversation at all.
Right.
What's the significance? What's the importance of this conversation? Why even bother to talk about what I think most people assume is a settled fact?
Right.
I think most people assume that what you're arguing here is not true.
Right.
Which
That's
is
my assumption.
Which is probably one of the reasons that we've been so slow in coming out with this book in the first place.
Yes.
Because we think, man, if you guys thought we were legalistic, persnickety people before, you hadn't seen
Check
anything.
This out.
All right. So understanding that's what our big vision is, that we're going to get back to the importance of this one in this conversation, why don't you just for a moment give us the argument of the book to begin this conversation? And then we'll spend all our time in the next conversation on it. But just so folks can know, some of you will have recently gotten this book as one of your T4G books. So there might be a lot of copies of this book out there. Friends might have begun to pick it up and read it and go, oh, what's this really about? Jonathan, what's the basic argument in the book?
Yeah. The basic argument is that Christians have not taken enough time to think about what the church is and adopted the first service and then multi-site practice without really looking at their Bibles. And that those practices, the multi-site, multi-service models, both basically reject what Jesus says the church is. They redefine the church and they reshape the church morally. Those multi-site church, that multi-site church is effectively multiple churches. Your North Campus is a church, your South Campus is a church. Your 9 o'clock service is a church, your 11 o'clock service is a church. So those churches are doing great things. Don't want to dispute that. Partners in the gospel, right? Yeah. Grateful for the evangelism, grateful for the preaching, grateful for the fellowship that occurs in all these churches. But I am saying a change has taken place in that multi-site, multi-service structure. Those are actually multiple churches. And in the process, they're changing the nature of Christian discipleship.
How are they changing the nature of Christian discipleship?
Well, if now I am united together, covenantally united together as a church with people with whom I never meet, the 11 o'clock, the 9 o'clock, the North Campus, the South Campus, and we exist together under one authority structure, one administrative mechanism, and that administrative mechanism is the thing that's called the church, and I'm accountable to that. Well, that's a subtle reshifting of authority, a subtle reshifting of the shape of my discipleship. In the same way, an Episcopal structure or a Presbyterian structure is going to subtly reshape the nature of discipleship.
Well, you mentioned a Presbyterian structure, and I understand what you mean theologically, but historically, the Westminster Assembly came up with a confession, and they would agree with you. They define a church as a particular local assembly. Yeah,
that's right. Nonetheless, a Presbyterian structure and an Episcopalian structure, what it does is it gives authority to something outside of the congregation.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? Both in the receiving or disciplining of members, the removing of pastors, and other things of this sort. And what that does, that shift in authority from all the congregation, the gathered congregation, to something outside of the congregation, has a subtle way of shifting the nature of my discipleship. Now, that's something worth double-clicking on, but that's the thumbnail sketch you were asking for.
So, yeah, and everything in me wants to have that conversation, but we'll leave that conversation next. For this, just to keep helping us understand how important this conversation is, wouldn't your concerns have been shown to be evidently misplaced by the recent quarantine that a lot of people had been under, where they couldn't meet. So many churches met virtually and small groups met virtually. I mean, didn't that disprove all your concerns?
Somebody tweeted me the other day asking, "Hey, Jonathan, is this not changing the ontology of the church?" And I replied, not at all. The church is what the Bible says the church is. We're in an exceptional moment, however, where we're taking exceptional measures, but that's sort of like walking around with a broken ankle. We're limping and we're using a crutch. Lord willing, we won't always be on a crutch. Lord willing, one day that ankle will heal and we'll be all together again, walking straight, right? So I would say if we were to persist in this state, the state of, say, the internet church or whatever, I think that over time we would all see how much that harms our discipleship. I think the gathering serves clear purposes that the Bible intends, and we're going to feel its absence, see its absence.
So you would say a time of abstinence from that gathering doesn't make the argument on the other side. It actually supports what you're saying.
I think
experientially.
I think that's exactly right.
So if the thesis of this book to many people's ears will be so extreme, how do you think it'll be misunderstood? Or is it kind of beyond misunderstanding? Because like whatever extreme conclusion they draw to, yes, that's what you're saying.
Yeah. I think a main misunderstanding is to think that you and I, Mark, are probably angrier about this, or think it's a bigger deal than we actually do.
So you would preach at a multi-site church and be happy with your image being reproduced video-wise 10 places around the state, and that sermon being going...
Take out happy with and put in willing to, yes.
Okay. You happily preach at a church with 2 services. You'll happily preach the 9:30 and the 11. I
would happily preach... with brothers and sisters who meet in 2 services, yeah.
Okay.
For the sake of those brothers and sisters. I'm not happy about that structure, no.
Right. Well, the same way you might happily preach in a Paedo-Baptist church, even though you're not happy about the Paedo-Baptism.
Yeah, that's right.
You're happy about your brothers and sisters in Christ and all the good they do.
Of course. Yeah. Well, what I want to do is I want to stick this right here in that kind of theological triage. First tier, gospel issues, salvation issues. Second tier, sort of those ecclesiological issues, right, which aren't essential to salvation, but which protect the gospel over time. I want to put it right there.
And which determine who we can work with in a lot of ways.
No, that's right. But it's right there with something like a Presbyterian church structure. What does Presbyterianism do? They redefine the church. Back to the Westminster Assembly, it's a church, it's believers and their children. That's the church. That's a redefinition of the church. And so what I'm saying, or what we have been saying, is that to say a church is these separate assemblies united under one administrative structure is a church, right there, second level of theological triage, it's a redefinition of the church. And I'm going to say it's not as important as a first tier issue, but it's more important than a third tier. We can be indifferent toward issue.
So what would be some examples of issues that even people as careful as 9 Marks would agree are third-tier issues?
The nature of the millennium.
Okay. How about touching ecclesiology?
Touching ecclesiology. Oh, that's a good question. I've not
what hymns we sing?
Oh, certainly what hymns. How long your sermons are. Frankly, to some extent, expositional preaching, I think, is finally something that's a matter of prudence. I think it's the best way. I think it's the most prudent way, the most wise way to preach the Bible.
It's the most theologically consistent.
Yeah, most theologically. But maybe I would put it there. The nature of our membership practices.
Whether or not you have membership classes.
Exactly, that sort of thing.
Right.
Whether or
not you have a church covenant.
But what you're giving me right now, Mark, are issues that we can, in some sense, disagree on and still be members of the same church.
Yeah.
A multi-site, multi-service structure, you got to make a decision. Either you are or you're not.
Right.
And so that almost necessarily puts it up into a second-tier issue.
Well, but you are and you are not on lots of the issues you just mentioned, but for some reason they don't seem as important. So you may or you may not have membership classes. You're going to do one or the other.
Of course, right. That's true. That's
but whichever you do, it might not be determinative into whether or not you feel you can in good conscience join that church.
No, that's right.
Whereas if a church has like 3 services on Sunday morning and members can choose to go to whichever one, then your concern is that the church never assembles.
Yeah.
And therefore it's not in what the Bible teaches in those terms is not a church.
Well, in that sense, I think our conversation just confused second versus third tier and the whole thing about elements versus forms. I think your forms, membership classes or not, that's you have to make a decision on, but it's not finally in the Bible.
So,
whereas this, I think, is in the Bible.
So you've had, I think, a slowly growing reputation as a theologian and as an ecclesiologist. Ecclesiologician, or whatever we could call it.
My Twitter description says an aspiring ecclesiologist.
An aspiring ecclesiologist. Any concern this is going to be like the nail in the tire? I mean, this is really where Lehman lost it.
Yeah,
right. I was following him along in his hard-to-read books and his less hard-to-read books, in his little tiny books, and they were all really helpful. Church membership, church discipline, such good stuff. And then he just went... He went a little too far.
Yeah. It's possible. We certainly feel, I think, the greatest risk with that book. And that's why we did more in preparing it than we typically do. So we got guys from around the country to come together, read an early draft, got a lot of feedback.
And it was funny. I'll tell you folks watching the feedback we got.
It was significant.
Well, and they're from guys who they're all agreeing with our thesis, or almost all anyway, but yet there was a very divided feeling. Like or some of the people, I should say, thought this book needed to be real sweet in tone, and oh guys, it's not that big a deal. But look over here. Let me try to persuade you.
Which my first draft was more in that direction.
And other people felt like, no, this has to be like Luther at the Reformation. You got to plant the flag, burn down the enemy villages.
And the final draft moves slightly more in that direction.
Yeah, but having read it, I wouldn't say it's very much in that direction. Okay. So anyway.
The whole day felt like a shin kicking.
Yeah. Well, for you especially. The brother very vulnerably laid his manuscript out there, and everybody had lots of opinions, and the opinions were not uniform. Although it was funny because we were all pretty much agreeing on the conclusions. The whole question was, how do you approach this?
How do you get there? That's right.
Because this is such a sensitive issue.
Well, because many churches in at least in the States, in the 1960s and 70s, started moving to multi-service. In the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, started moving to multisite. Yeah. And they admit, in their own books, never gave it much study. They were, as one author put it, building the plane in the air.
Well, right? I think they were assuming there was no problem here theologically.
No, that's right.
In the same way when they have the new air conditioning put in, they assume there's no problem theologically.
And so here we are 4 or 5 decades on saying, oh, hold up, guys.
Yeah.
Can we go back and look at the Bible? And that's just not going to make you popular.
And I think that the arguments for having, let's just say, multiple services seem so straightforwardly sensible.
Right.
I'm here in the constraints of an old building in an urban area.
Right.
By God's grace, we got full.
Right.
We can deal with that somewhat by church planting. So see you, Jonathan. But the thing fills back up.
Yep.
Couldn't we reach more people without spending any more money? I mean, maybe some more staff, but without a huge expenditure, without lots of problems and, of years of construction. Couldn't we just, by having 2 different services on Sunday morning, or one on Saturday night and one on Sunday morning, couldn't we just have a lot more fruitful ministry with a much more economic use of resources? I think it's the kind of stewardship argument that I think has been the leading argument for 50 years.
And those aren't bad arguments.
In
it makes sense.
Moving to multiple services, at least.
No, that's exactly right. And insofar as your understanding of the church is driven by that sort of evangelistic impulse to grow and reach more people, it makes utter sense.
Well, I would almost say driven solely.
Right. Well, I think that's
because I hope that both your church and mine are driven by an evangelistic impulse.
Absolutely.
So I don't want to in any way be opposed to that. We're definitely for evangelism.
No, but I just mean to kind of pit it against also grown by discipleship, teaching them everything I have commanded, and so forth.
I would say in the New Testament, the assumption is if the saints are growing, if the church is being edified,
that will be evangelistic.
Yeah, then that will naturally have the overflow of more evangelism happening, more people coming to Christ.
Well, in some ways, I think it's the difference between short-term thinking and long-term thinking. Yeah. Short-term thinking says, okay, second service, more people in the room, we're good.
Yeah.
Long-term thinking, I think, says actually a growing, vibrant body of people getting to know one another, discipling one another, disciplining one another, encouraging one another. Yeah. That, over time, will prove to be the most evangelistic. So not opposed to evangelism, but opposed to short-term thinking.
So I'll drop this part of the question in just a minute, but I just want to make sure we get this finally. You did make the decision at some point, or we made the decision at some point, to go ahead for all of our concerns about being pigeonholed irrevocably.
Yes.
You did decide, okay, let's go ahead and put this out there.
Right.
What helped to bring you over the edge to say, like, no, we need to teach on this publicly? Like in a more reified form, in a book.
Number one, the fact that nobody or almost nobody else is out there making this argument. A couple of brothers did in their book, Franchising the Church, John Mark Yates and Thomas White doing that book. A few essays out there, articles out there you'll see, but nobody really seems to be taking this on. So number one, just nobody else is.
Yeah.
Number two, because in a weird way, as obscure as this topic is, and in some sense feelings of fringe, it sort of gets right to the heart of what a church is.
I think you can drop the sort of. I mean, I think it does.
And that is going to impact how we live and grow as Christians and disciple one another. Again, just as important as arguments we might have over Episcopal structure, Presbyterian structure, and so forth.
But see, when you say just as important as those arguments these days are seen as not that important.
Good
By
point.
many people think, you do whatever works. I mean, that's been Lutheran position, always has been that. But, in American evangelicalism more broadly, people who 150 years ago would have argued between themselves about those questions, maybe even 70 years ago, during our lifetime, they've been good with just whatever you want to do, whatever your church,
Well,
feels.
Mark, as you've always said, 9 marks exist in part to bring up what your great-grandparents always assumed and understood.
Yeah.
So in that sense, we are trying to revive some of these older conversations because we think they're significant, and the failure to have these conversations, I think we can both see, has proved harmful, not health-giving, to churches in America and around the world.
And I think the recent and increasing prominence of teleworking, telehealth, telechurch, video groups is simply going to make these questions more exposed, more obvious, because you're going to think the church is essentially what happens up front, and you can bring that out to people via video link and audio. Or you're going to think the church is fundamentally the gathering together of the people,
congregation,
in 1,000 interactions that can't be captured just in what happens from the front. And anyway, we can talk about that.
Well, let me say one thing on that. There's a bit of a chicken and egg thing here, because something I argue in the book, and at least in the introduction, there's a sense in which we wouldn't have got to multi-service or multi-site in the first place if we didn't already view church as what happens up front. Church as what up front, so when the pastors come along and say, hey, let's add a service, let's add a site, that doesn't offend my sensibilities or my intuitions about what a church is. If I've already adopted, hey, I show up for, 90 minutes, 60 minutes on Sunday, and there's a good show, and great, and then I go home. Hey, another service, another show, great, sounds good. So there's a sense in which those changed views of what a church is, changed intuitions, are what made the whole movement possible in the first place.
Yeah.
But then, as you say, I think our practices can then turn around and reinforce that.
Yeah, I want to wrap this conversation up soon, because I don't mean this conversation to be too long. I'd like us to get to that other conversation.
Setting the context.
About the substance of the argument. But just for folks who are watching, who are wondering, is this just a conversation for large church pastors? How is this an important conversation for smaller church pastors, or the church planter with 70 people, or the congregation with 70 people in it? How is this an important conversation for them?
Let me say two things there. Number one, I don't really assume that the main audience of this book is the mega church, multi-site pastor.
This book is not going to make them rethink. They're not in that market.
In some ways,
they're not coming to the conference. They're not asking the questions.
In some ways, I'm really only aiming at the smaller churches that might grow some, might add a second service. I'm aiming at the next generation.
Yeah.
That's the first thing I would say. The second thing is,
so if you're a 70-year-old megachurch pastor with 4 locations and 3 services in each, God bless you. If you're preaching the gospel, we are thankful for you. We're not really guessing you're going to take time to read this. And if so, we're not guessing you're going to find it persuasive, though maybe.
Yeah. So, yeah, leave that there. The second thing I would say is, okay, chapter 1 is the church as an embassy of the kingdom. Chapter 2 is church as a gathering. Chapter 3 is the church as small c, Catholic. And that's what I really hope. That's sort of the alternative to Multisite. That's the vision. I hope
church is an area working together.
Yes. The partnerships between different churches. I hope small churches that never are even threatened by the possibility of growing enough that they would go to a multi-service or multi-site. I hope they will capture the vision of their church partnering with other churches in ways that raise up leaders and send churches. I hope that's inspiring. That third chapter, I hope it's inspiring to people about what the landscape as a whole, I think, and I've seen modeled here at Capital Baptist and other churches in our area, I've seen modeled wonderfully. I hope everybody gets that vision.
Yeah. Lest we make this book sound too dire, Jonathan has done a great job making some tough, tight, biblical, theological, historical arguments in the first couple of chapters. But then in the third chapter, he just paints a wonderful, glorious, happy picture of a future and of a land of cooperation that I don't think seems very native to a lot of churches today. I have to take that back. There are certainly churches that it does, but there's so many churches in which it does not seem normal, in which it seems like an alien land. And if nothing else, if you're not too interested in the argument of this book, just cheat and read chapter 3.
Amen. That's right.
And just enjoy thinking about how your multi-service, multi-site church can be in friendly cooperation with other churches and trying to help them in preaching the gospel.
In some way, I almost wanted to put chapter 3 first so that people could believe and see a vision. And that almost makes the argument easier to follow after that.
Yeah. Brother, thank you for the time. I hope you've been persuaded that it's worth thinking about this topic and that Jonathan Leeman's book, One Assembly, might help you do that. Thanks, brother.
Thanks.